Hello, all. My name is Algernon Austin. I'm the Director for Race and Economic Justice at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. The Center for Economic and Policy Research, also known as CEPR, was established to promote democratic debate on the most important economic and social issues that affect people's lives. Welcome to the third installment of our four-part webinar series commemorating the 60th anniversary of the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom. These events are brought to you by CEPR as part of the Full Employment for All Coalition. You can find out more about the coalition at fullemploymentforall.org. Before we begin our great panel on the continuing struggle for freedom, I want to remind you that we have our final webinar, our fourth and final webinar next Wednesday. Please register for next week's webinar on evaluating our progress on jobs and freedom and needed next steps. You should find the registration link in the chat. Next week's panel will look in detail at areas where we have made economic progress, where we have stagnated, and where we have regressed. The panelists will also discuss what is needed for the country to once again move forward on economic justice and civil rights. It will be a great webinar, and I encourage you to register for it. Unfortunately, because of developments beyond everyone's control, we have a new moderator for today's panel. The moderator for today's panel is Cedric Lawson, who is the field director of the leadership at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I'll now hand it off to Cedric.
Thank you, Algernon, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Cedric Lawson. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm field director at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. It is a pleasure to join you all as moderator of this outstanding panel, especially considering my own organizing and mobilization work in these areas that we'll discuss. We're joined by dedicated, seasoned advocates who are sharing their time and expertise with us. First, we have Barbara Arnwine, President and Founder, Transformative Justice Coalition. Amber Kuntz, Assistant Counsel of NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, LDF. Friendly heads up that Amber Kuntz is stepping in for Jared Evans of NAACP LDF, who is tied up in court this afternoon. And we also have Michael Lieberman, Senior Policy Counsel, Hate and Extremism, Southern Poverty Law Center. So with those introductions made, participants, just as a friendly heads up, please feel free to write your questions in the chat during this discussion. In addition, we'll do our best to leave time at the end for question and answers with the goal of ending this webinar promptly at 2 p.m. So with that, now on to our timely questions. Panelists, we are in a period where there are many different attacks on our civil rights occurring at the same time. Broadly speaking, how would you characterize this current moment? Are we witnessing an attempt to overturn all the gains of the civil rights movement and return us to an America of the 1940s or some other earlier period? Barbara, would you please start us off?
Thank you so much, Cedric. What an honor it is to be on this panel. I really admire all my co-panelists, work with their organizations for a long time. I would characterize this period as one of a dangerous resurgence of desperation for white structural racism, and that in a nation of laws, we got to recognize that our scales of justice are fragile, very fragile, collapsible, as we've seen in the 18 states that have already made it necessary for groups to go underground to literally fight against the injustices that they have tried to impose upon the citizenry. And I'm thinking about, that those who are involved in resistance, they have criminalized the very nature of resisting. So I'm thinking about the anti-repro rights, laws, the anti-transgender laws, the anti-don't say gay laws. I'm thinking about the attacks on affirmative action, the book banning, the don't teach Black history as a teacher or you're going to get fined and in prison, jail for it. I'm talking about, all of these really ugly, movements that we're watching right now. And these are worse than the 40s. I'm sorry. The 40s, they just didn't teach Black history. They didn't talk about they were going to put everybody in jail for teaching it. But now we're at a new stage because people are really buying into these anti-democracy forces, right wing, really basically white supremacist notions, and this determination that that a multiracial democracy is dangerous. That's why they teach that great, what they call the white replacement theory, because they fear that a multiracial democracy where everybody has an equal voice is dangerous. And don't forget that in all the forces that are out there that are anti-democracy, that are helping support this madness, this neo-fascism wave that we're watching in our lifetime, that we're having to fight, that they also are really anti-regulatory. We saw that in the Biden versus Nebraska case. If people haven't read Kagan's dissent in that case, you need to go read it right now. It's probably the most significant dissent. And I know the affirmative action dissents of Jackson and Sotomayor are amazing, but this dissent you got to read because she really frames the court's tendencies in such a powerful way. So let's be clear that the anti-regulatory corporatist forces are also at play. So we have work to do. And I'm here to talk about how we do that work and how we fight, this moment that we're in, and how we save a democracy, a multiracial democracy for future generations. Thank you.
Absolutely, Barbara. Thank you. Amber, same question.
So I'll only add on to what Barbara just said, that they're anti-regulatory in the corporate sphere because they're more than happy to regulate women's bodies. But I want to thank Sieper and Algernon for bringing us all together today for this timely conversation, and thank my fellow panelists. Just so honored to be a part of this conversation. I would characterize what we're experiencing as what Nina Simone song calls backlash blues, a period of backlash, what others have coined white lash. That is to say that this is nothing new, that in the United States, we have a pattern of whenever there is progress made for Black Americans, we experience, as Barbara just mentioned, legal backlash through our laws, physical violence as a form of backlash. So after Reconstruction, when Black Americans were freed from enslavement and took up the banner of citizenry, joined state houses, launched businesses, you saw Jim Crow come down as the legal backlash and lynchings to put Black people in their subordinate place. Many would argue, as Ta-Nehisi Coates has argued, after the election of our first Black president, Barack Obama, you had the backlash, the white lash of the wholly unqualified Donald Trump, who promoted racist rhetoric and racist policies. And I would argue that what we're experiencing now is the backlash in response to the cultural awakening that came after the murder of George Floyd. So in the summer of 2020, after many in this nation saw a Black man murdered slowly on their national news, many white Americans specifically started asking questions and seeking more information about why Black Americans were so poorly treated in this country, how we came to be in the subordinate position. You saw white Americans start asking, why do we have statues erected to Confederate soldiers? If this was a side that was treasonous to what this country was supposed to stand for. And you had businesses and corporations coming out and making pledges of support to uplift the economic standing of Black Americans. And I believe that in response to that moral awakening in this country, we are now experiencing a backlash that seeks to strip any education of the positioning of Black Americans in this country, the history of how we've been treated in this country, to strip public conversation about how to address the positioning of racial minorities in this country. And it also bleeds over into the LGBTQIA community to strip any consciousness or conversation about sexual minorities in this country. And so all that to say, I would characterize what we're experiencing as backlash or whitelash.
Thank you, Amber. Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Cedric. Let me just start by congratulating CFER on this 60th anniversary March on Washington webinar series, the entire series, and really thanks for inviting the Southern Poverty Law Center to participate. When I think about the current moment, we've already used the word dangerous, and I want to second that and call it challenging. And let me make 3 points. First, this is a time when the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, the White House, the National Security Intelligence apparatus, all of them agree that the most lethal threat, the most lethal current domestic extremist threat is white supremacist, racially motivated, violent groups and extremists, and anti-government extremists like militia groups. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been doing an annual assessment of hate groups and extremist groups in the United States for the past several decades. The report is called Year in Hate and Extremism. The most recent report was released a couple months ago, and our principal finding for the year's report is the normalization of hate, the mainstreaming of extremism that we have seen that is so painful and so impactful. We have documented an embrace, and Barbara has already referenced it, an embrace of the Great Replacement theory. This conspiracy theory, this lie, posits that Jews and others, Democrats, liberals, are plotting to bring Black and brown immigrants into this country in order to replace white people. This conspiracy theory has inspired murders. We've seen it. The most horrible anti-Semitic incident in the history of the United States, the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, the murders in El Paso in 2019, 23 mostly Latinx people murdered, and then at the Buffalo Tops Market. All of these murders, all of these hate crime murders, 10 people murdered in 2022 in Buffalo, these lies kill. And the idea that there are many Republican legislators who are using this exact same invader language, this exact same anti-immigrant rhetoric, that we are being invaded, that our borders are being overrun. This has a tremendous impact, a tremendous damaging to the nation. And then I think the third challenge is just the lack of faith in our institutions, diminishing trust in the pillars of our democracy. We've never had a former president refuse to acknowledge that he lost the election, promote lies of a stolen election, and call out his supporters to come to Washington in his defense to try and block the transfer of a peaceful transition to a new president. We believe that it is essential for the planners and perpetrators of the deadly January 6th attack on the US Capitol and those who inspired and funded them to be held accountable with serious consequences. SPLC provided expert testimony for the January 6th Select Committee on these points, elevating some of them. Obviously, in the past week, we've seen much progress made on this, not just in the past week, but some very prominent indictments in the past week having to do with this lack of trust, these lies, and certainly we think more needs to be done.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, panelists. Moving on to our next question, Michael, you'll begin. Amber, I'll call you second, and Barbara for the last panel question for all panelists. So if you could share with us, the civil rights activists of the 1950s and the 1960s fought for an end to racial discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and housing, for voting rights, and for freedom from lynching and other forms of racial violence. What is the status of this struggle today? Please pick just one area or issue and give us your assessment, starting with Michael.
So, I think it's weird to say that I want to talk about lynchings and hate crimes, but I'm going to pick it up there. I think groups like the NAACP and the Equal Justice Institute have documented that there are about 4,700 lynchings that occurred in our country between 1882 and 1968. About 75% of those lynching victims were Black. Since 1991, the FBI has been collecting and reporting on hate crimes from the nation's 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. They are collecting this data based on race, on religion, on sexual orientation, on other personal characteristics. The report that the FBI does every year under the Hate Crime Statistics Act is very incomplete, but it is the best national snapshot of hate violence in the United States. The most current data is from 2021. And in 2021, the FBI documented the highest number of hate crimes in the 30-year history, the highest number of race-based crimes, the highest number of anti-AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander crimes, the highest number of anti-Hispanic crimes, the highest number of anti-trans crimes. Since 1991, race-based crimes have always, every year, been the most prevalent, the most prominent, the most numerous hate crimes, and crimes against Blacks and African Americans have always been the vast plurality of those race-based crimes. But there are thousands of agencies in the United States, thousands of the 18,000 that did not report any hate crime data to the FBI. And there are about 80% of the rest of the agencies that affirmatively reported to the FBI that they had 0 hate crimes in 2021, including dozens of cities over 100,000 in population. So we believe strongly that since data drives policy, that it's time to make hate crime reporting mandatory. We are working with a broad coalition of civil rights, religious, education, even law enforcement groups to make that happen, or to condition funding on credible reporting. So we need better data on hate crimes, better data on political violence, better data on white supremacy in policing and in the military, and on extremist content online.
Thank you, Michael. Amber.
So I'll speak about the progress or lack thereof that we've made when it comes to ending racial discrimination in public education. Something I wasn't aware of until I joined the Legal Defense Fund is we are still actively litigating dozens of desegregation cases, oftentimes in partnership with the Department of Justice, that have been open since just post Brown versus Board of Education coming down, meaning there are dozens of school districts in this country that have not successfully desegregated, taking away what are called racially identifiable schools, where you can look at a school and say, oh, that's the Black school or that's the white school, and still failing to equitably distribute public resources between the schools. I know just in my own experience, my public school was not under an active desegregation order, but we still had racially identifiable schools. The Black schools had textbooks that were outdated, did not have enough chairs, while the white schools were often very well resourced. So I would say that we still have a long way to go in that sphere as far as ending racial discrimination in public education. We also know something that I'll elaborate on later, but in the United States, studies have shown that the race of a student, more than any other variable, including their socioeconomic status, the student's race determines the number of AP courses they have access to, the years of experience their teachers have on average, the number of honors courses they have access to. And these are variables that often determine where you're able to go to college. These are variables that institution of higher education take into consideration when going through their admissions processes. And so if those variables are determined by your race more than any other aspect that you may contain, and if we know that we still have schools that are racially identifiable and not receiving equitable resources, then I would say that that amounts to understand that from the 1950s and 1960s, we still have a lot of progress to make in that area.
Thank you, Amber. Barbara.
Yes, I want to talk about voting. Voting's been my obsession since I published, the Map of Shame in 2011. I predicted then that we would see a Trump era, because I agree, a lot with Amber that we have the zigzag and the reality of backlash. I mean, that's one of the dynamics of white structural racism, as is, denial, racial denial, and all the other repressive, tactics that are used. But what's different in this era is that in the past, other than the very beginning of colonial America, where you had more Blacks in South Carolina and Virginia than you had whites, most of the last decades, the last centuries have been about Blacks being a minority, right? And about Latinos being a minority, and the country still being majority white. Well, what's happening now, of course, is that the racial demographics have been shifting. And I predicted that one of the things that would happen is that because of this buy-in to white structural racism, that whites are the dominant class, and that there's, white supremacy is the rule of the land, that in fact, that is the closer we got to that demographic exchange, where people of color would become the majority of this population and would be able to have, a real say in this democracy, the more we were likely to see serious resistance, serious, opposition, that we would see not only a Trump, but Trumps all over the place. And that's what we're seeing. This is inevitable. It's an inevitable conflict in our racial dynamic. That the reality is that as we come to that exchange, people are going to fight it. Corporatists fight it because what do they know? That what they see is that all the polling data tells them that people of color are more willing and more favorable to corporate regulation, period. And they believe in climate change. They believe that you got to have regulations to prevent, over profiting, that you got to have good taxation policies, all these things that they don't believe in. And so what we're seeing is this confluence of this white supremacist. This is a white nation. We don't want nobody to share it with anybody else except for our puppets, that kind of, mentality. And we're seeing at the same time this whole, fight, within the corporatist community because of the threats that are being posed to people by economic inequality and by the realities of climate change and so many others. So what is happening is that voter suppression has become the law of the land. You have all these states that have been passing more voter suppression laws than what I complained about in 2011. People like to talk about what happened in the Holder versus Shelby case, but frankly, it really started right after the Obama election and the 2010 midterm election. That's when we really saw this trend line, and it just keeps getting worse and deeper because white resentment, which is the basis of the great white replacement theory, it's being driven by this demographic change. And so we got to really be committed to fighting back. We got to be pro-democracy like we've never been before. We got to engage in these things. I really would encourage people to go to tjcoalition.org and see the 72 forms of voter suppression so you can understand what's going on, what our fight looks like. And I would encourage people to do more. But I just want to say, our voting rights are central to everything. We can't fight hate crimes without a Voting Rights Act. Did you know that whole Montgomery Rumble everybody's talking about, where the blacks came to defend the poor black man who was being beaten up by the whites? You know, there's no hate crimes law in Alabama, none. It does not exist in Alabama. We need to, when Ahmaud Arbery was killed, there was no such law in Georgia. We need to understand that, that this is part of the problem, that, everything we complain about, women's rights, etc., all of it comes down to your voting. And voting is key. Making sure that we have an open democracy, that we stop all this voter suppression, that we engage our citizenry is the most important thing that we can do.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you. And now we'll move into individual questions for our panelists. In recent years, the courts, especially the Supreme Court, have overturned legal precedents or radically interpreted laws. I would like you all to explain and comment on some of these decisions. So Michael, first question is for you. Michael Waldman of the Brennan Center for Justice states that, quote, for 218 years, judges overwhelmingly concluded that the Second Amendment simply authorized states to form militias, which now we call the National Guard. In the 21st century, extremist right-wing judges have aggressively restricted the state government's ability to require gun safety measures. What has this meant for the safety of the American people, and particularly people of color?
So I think we need to start with some orders of magnitude. There are something like 400 million guns in the United States, and people know that that's way more than the number of people in the United States. There were 49,000 gun-related deaths in the most recent year, for which there's data. About half of them are suicides, and the vast majority of the others are murders. 80% of these murders are with firearms, the highest number since 1968. And Blacks are grossly disproportionately impacted by gun violence. Black Americans make up the majority of gun homicide victims. Homicide is the leading cause of death for Black boys and men ages 15 to 44, and 80% of those involve firearms. So at this time, you would think that cities, states would want to take any step that they possibly could take to restrict access to firearms, or at least have some kind of reasonable gun violence prevention, waiting lists, number of arms that you could acquire, the amount of bullets that you could put in your gun. But no, the United States Supreme Court has a very, very different view. And in the last term of the Supreme Court, the court struck down the New York handgun licensing law 6-3. It was a reasonable law in New York that in order to get a handgun permit, you needed to show some reasonable reason, some purpose for why you needed to be able to carry a handgun. The United States Supreme Court, in a decision written by Justice Thomas, said no, that there are very broad rights under the Second Amendment, said Justice Thomas, a broad right to carry a handgun outside the home for what he called self-defense, and really held that restrictions on owning a weapon, a firearm, carrying it in public could only be made if there's a tradition of such regulation in US history. This is going back to what Amber and Barbara have talked about in terms of looking backwards for what should be forward-looking rules, regulations, the way that we govern our institutions. In the next term, there is a case that the Supreme Court has already taken involving domestic violence, domestic violent abusers. Can they have access to a firearm? The court originally said no. In the aftermath of this case that Justice Thomas wrote in the last term, the court said yes. And now that case is coming before the Supreme Court. I think those rules are very much a danger going forward in terms of access to firearms, it's a real concern.
Thank you, Michael. Next question is for Barbara. Barbara, I just want to highlight something that you had mentioned earlier, which is the inevitable connection in between, of course, democratic engagement across the board, but in particular reproductive rights. And we have seen that in the past year. With that said, this question, with the Dobbs decision, the Supreme Court eliminated the constitutional right to an abortion, overturning a 50-year precedent. What has this decision meant for women across the United States, and especially women of color?
First of all, thank you. And this is Michael, that was excellent on guns. Loved it. I just want to say that, the Dobbs voters have been changing everything. We just saw it, a week ago in the Ohio initiative fight, where women were the largest group of newly registered voters, were young women by far. And where, the turnout was heavily women based. And I want to, point out that there's a connection, folks, between all of this, because what nobody wants to talk about is that the great white replacement theory is part of this anti-repro rights, because they believe that white women aren't having enough babies. And that's why they oppose abortion and other contraceptive use. It's not just abortion. They want to ban all contraceptions, period. So because they believe that white women aren't having enough babies. It's not about Black women. The Dobbs case came out of Mississippi. Guess what happened after the Dobbs case was decided? The death rate, the maternal death rate for Black women increased threefold. It killed Black women, did not protect us from anything. So there is that whole misconception out there. People talk about, well, the founder of the Planned Parenthood, she had these racist ideals, so did almost everybody else who was living who was white at that time, except for people who were conscious, anti-racist, conscious, conscious pro-abolitionists. But I do want people to understand that these laws are tied to the same white supremacist theory. So what has to happen? And what's great is what we saw in Kansas, what we saw in Ohio, what we've been seeing across the nation. We're 8 for 8. Every place where there's been a pro-abortion issue. And remember, of course, issue one was not abortion on its face, but was designed to affect the abortion initiative that would be brought up later in the year. So what I want people to understand is that, part of what we have to do is create broad coalitions. We gotta, remember I mentioned that registration factor is, we gotta register these 8 million folks out here, some 50 million people in total who aren't registered, and 8 million are people of color, mostly Black. We need to, really get out there and do this work, folks. We also got to be, really attentive to this redistricting scheme. Don't forget about the Milligan case, which the Alabama state legislature decided that they're going to be openly defiant. And they're not going to follow any Supreme Court law because they're the great state of Alabama. They're going to do what they want to do. Well, we're going to see what the what the district court does there. They just had a hearing yesterday, on Monday, that is. They just had a hearing. And what happened in that hearing was that the judges asked, straight up, are you in defiance of this order? And LaCour, who is their state attorney general solicitor, and basically tried to dodge it. But yes, they're in defiance. And so we know that we got to win these redistricting cases. We know that we got to have massive, not only voter registration, but also voter contacts, because it doesn't mean a darn thing. If you register people, you got to give them a reason to vote. And you got to have massive voter restoration all over this country. There are 18 million people who are eligible to vote who don't vote because they were formerly incarcerated, and they fear that if they vote, if they register, or if they vote, they're going to end up in jail because they're watching old crazy Florida and DeSantis and all of that, and they're fearful that they're going to end up like Crystal Mason, in Texas. They're so fearful, and they don't understand that every state law is different, and that the majority of the states allow you to register and to vote if you were formerly incarcerated. Some, 20 allow you to do it immediately. So there's a lot of confusion. We got work to do on that front, and we got to also end here. We got to study the Michigan initiative, folks. Do you realize that Michigan is now a state that 10 years ago, where there was a huge racial gap between Black and whites in voter turnout, but because of the initiatives in 2018 and the initiatives in 2022, that voter gap now is gone. Blacks are voting high at the same rate as whites because they did a whole lot of good, what I call voting rights reforms that have really made it easier for people to register, to vote. They take away all that voter suppression that was vicious. They tried to do many, really progressive things in voting. We need that all over the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And for Amber, this, of course, is in line with the remarks that you shared regarding the trajectory of students across the country and the impact that race does have on that set trajectory. With the recent anti-affirmative action decision, the Supreme Court narrowed affirmative action in higher education, overturning a 45-year precedent. What is the significance of this decision?
So I really want to lean on what Barbara just said about the Great Replacement theory undergirding all of this. I love that because I really think the Great Replacement theory, or the resentment that a Black student may be replacing a white student's spot, that resentment is driving a lot of this hatred, frankly, toward affirmative action and integrative measures, as I like to describe them. So I was a part of the team that wrote the amicus brief supporting UNC's what we called race conscious admissions program. And I believe we have a link to that we can share, but we thought it was really important to ground the court in the history of why affirmative action was needed in the first place in this country. UNC was founded in 1789. It did not admit its first Black students until 1957. That's after Brown, and that was by court order. So Black attorneys had to sue the state university to admit Black students centuries after its founding and after the Brown decision. With that in mind, it's deeply upsetting that any measures this university was taking to integrate its class was found to be unacceptable by the court. And just to give you some numbers, even with its race conscious admissions program that just took a student's race into consideration along with many other factors, AP courses, SAT scores, extracurriculars, the school still only had 95 Black men in an incoming freshman class of nearly 5,000 students. What we saw in California after they banned affirmative action, the number of Black and Latino students plummeted by nearly 40%. And there was a decrease in the number of qualified Black and Latino students who were willing to apply to those schools. One thing I want to say is, even though this is the bleak reality we're facing, I do think there are things we can do to push back against this. It's important that we hold our alma maters accountable to still consider an applicant's race or what an applicant writes about their race. The Supreme Court said, Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, said that schools should still consider what an applicant writes about how their race has impacted them, whether it's inspired them or colored their life experience in some way. And I'm stressing this caveat because I think it's important that we, as mentors of young people, as parents of young people, as folks who might be writing recommendation letters for young people, encourage them to tell their story, including aspects of their identity that they would want a university consider. And we also need to press on our alma maters to continue to read those essays, taking into account applicants' identities in a meaningful way. in a meaningful way that results in integrated, diverse incoming classes. So with that said, the significance of the decision is that it's going to make it harder for these institutions that, let's be real, segregation was a race-conscious admissions policy. If you were Black, you were not admitted. So for the court to now determine that affirmative measures we were making to integrate our institutions are unacceptable is deeply upsetting. But I do want to encourage us to push for young people to continue to write about their identity, write about their experiences, and for these institutions to continue taking those writings into consideration.
Thank you, Amber. And we have another set of questions regarding the importance of the judiciary in regards to civil rights. As we have been discussing, there is a radical judicial movement that has no qualms about overturning precedents. Not too long ago, the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, LDF, wondered if Brown v. Board of Education, if that decision might be at risk. Is this radical right-wing movement planning to overturn Brown or just distort the meaning of the decision? So with that in mind, Amber, the NAACP LDF has observed that about 30 nominees to the federal judiciary have failed to say whether they support the Brown decision. Why do you think that there's a movement against supporting Brown? And what would overturning Brown, that major Supreme Court decision, mean for the United States?
I'll bring it back to what Barbara has been talking about. I think that there is a movement to distort, dilute, whitewash the meaning of Brown because of the Great Replacement theory, right? Brown gave our federal government the mandate to look at race and use the acknowledgement and observation of race and federal resources to integrate its institutions, to integrate its educational institutions. And I believe that because of resentment of a Black youth or a Black individual receiving specifically federal funding, federal resources, targeted intervention, targeted integration is what has led to this dilution of Brown, distortment of Brown, and really a lie about Brown, that it stands for a colorblind remedy to what was a race-based caste system in the United States for so long. When our government had to send federal troops to protect students integrating schools, that was not a colorblind intervention. The federal resources had to go to Black students, to protect Black students, because they were not safe integrating white schools. And I think that also this bleeds into the attack on not teaching about Black history, because the more folks understand that we have had to have throughout history race-conscious, targeted interventions to generate equality, then we wouldn't be able to stand for the nonsense that the Supreme Court is spouting out right now about colorblindness, about, I believe Justice Roberts wrote that the benefits of racial diversity weren't measurable, that there was no end goal discussed with these integrative programs. And again, we're talking about an end goal on affirmative action when it was being used at an institution that kept Black folks out for over 200 years. So it had only been allowing Black folks in, since the late 50s. So I just think that, yes, the dilution is intentional. It's intentional because there is fear or resentment about Black folks taking over what have been traditionally exclusive white spaces. And I think that it's on us to continue teaching the accurate history about why integration is necessary, why race-conscious federal measures to integrate our society have been necessary throughout history and remain necessary today.
Thank you, Amber. And for Barbara and Michael, if you have additional comments you'd like to add, how has the meaning of Brown been twisted in recent cases brought by the Supreme Court or even lower courts that you may have in mind?
Well, let me pick up, because that was excellent, Amber. And I've been just of course, I've been reading the Harvard and UNC case, over and over and over again. And I think there's a couple things that we need to tell people. One is these 19 or so attorney generals who are running around misinterpreting that case, that it's urgent that people call that out. We have with the National Bar Association, the country's largest association of Black lawyers, met recently. And that was one of our conclusions, is that our lawyers have to be engaged in fighting every state that is over-interpreting that decision. That decision is limited to admissions. And even within admissions, it's contradictory, because it says that military schools can still do affirmative action, race-conscious affirmative action, all the way. No end, no modality, no nexus, none of that is required if it's a military academy. Yet they did not talk about ROTC programs and others at these major institutions, and they also, went along with the, legacy exemptions plus the athletic race consciousness. So think about it, folks. There's some weird stuff in that decision. That's why I think Lone Range, it can't stand, and it's wrong. It couldn't overturn Brown. It couldn't overturn, Reuter. So what it does is it quote tries to quote distinguish them, but really doesn't. I mean, it's just a terrible decision. It's horribly written, totally inconsistent. The standing doctrine in that case is the same stupid standing doctrine we saw in the Alinas case, which is the quote creative web designer who didn't want to do something for people who were LGBTQIA because she didn't believe in same-sex marriages. Turns out because they did not apply their usual doctrine of actual case or controversies, that she lied. It appears that that case was a lie, that there was no real case or controversy, that it was the gentleman who allegedly made the request said he never made it, did not even understand how he got involved in the case. That's the court not doing its job, not following the Constitution that requires that for standing, you got to have an actual case or controversy. So, but in the same problem here. Also, I thought, it was really important that Amber talked about the history, the fact that between the founding of Harvard, which was done on the backs of slave money, money that was the profits from slavery that helped to build the institution, to this racial exclusion of Blacks until late 1950, that none of that's talked about in the case at all. Because none of the history of UNC's very blatant racial discrimination is talked about in the case, because then the issue would have been remediation, right? And they didn't want to go there. So there's a lot of flaws in that decision. I don't think it can stand the test of time. I think it's going to fall without question. And I think Brown is essential, because Brown is about not only racial integration, but it's about aggressive tactics to get there. To make, forced integration. It had, it said we got to get rid of racial discrimination and education, root and branch in the Green case. I mean, all of these things that people don't, that's inconsistent with this backwards thinking. The last thing I want to say, folks, is there's a connection between Biden versus Nebraska, the student debt case, and the affirmative action case that people need to think about. That is that they both have one result, that is to create a permanent underclass in our society, that there's an economic motive here to really make sure that African Americans don't have the same quote elite degrees so that they can't compete with wealthy privileged whites, that the only Blacks they want in the schools are athletes and military people. But anyway, I just think that we got to understand that there's a permanent underclass being created. If you can't, who needs the student loans? Blacks. Who has the highest number of student loans proportionately in income? Black women, Blacks. So, we got to really understand that these two cases go hand in glove towards creating a permanent underclass.
Michael, if you have anything to add, and then we'll move
Yeah,
into
I mean, my
questions.
colleagues Amber and Barbara are so eloquent and passionately correct on that question. The one thing that I would add, Cedric, and you set the question up with the word radical. One of the radical ways that the court has misused, abused Brown v. Board is to suggest that, like Brown v. Board, you overturned a precedent, a really bad precedent. Plessy v. Ferguson was really bad, separate but equal. Don't you feel like sometimes it's appropriate for the court to overturn bad precedents? And that's just abused. It was abused in the Dobbs case. It was abused in the affirmative action case that Amber spoke so eloquently about. So that's just another radical misuse of Brown v. Board.
Absolutely. Thank you, panelists. And as I take a look at the questions, what I'm planning to do is I'll share some of the statements that folks have made. Then I'll share some of the questions, keeping in mind that I'm seeing a larger thread here in terms of political division, in terms of division of constituencies against a common opposition of civil and human rights. And I'll close with a question that I want you all to answer with the previous questions in mind. So those statements that I see, the obsession with natality is a key feature of autocratic and especially fascist environments. Florida voters overwhelmingly voted or voting to restore voting rights. Their governor choosing to ignore this. I'll add actively working against the will of the voters after Amendment 4. Then also taking a look at the House Republicans have very publicly attacked the efforts of DOD Constellation. I see Constellation, but I assume Confirmation, and their Senator Tuberville, who lives in a state that he does not represent, says this individual who single-handedly is undermining the defense of the U.S. So with that said, also taking a look at some of these questions, I'm seeing that this common thread here, military recruitment is down, and it could be another aspect of the white supremacist theory to throw minorities into combat while protecting their own. Discrimination against Asian Americans was the basis for this latest affirmative action case in the Supreme Court, is part of the white supremacist agenda to divide and conquer as much as possible. How is the phenomenon of mass incarceration and police brutality affecting the continuing struggle of freedom for Black Americans? Are we seeing any improvement under this presidential administration? And then finally, before moving into the last question, as stated during the webinar, there have been many attacks on racial equity within education. How is this affecting the quality of life of our young people? And what have we witnessed in the role of young people fighting back against recent attacks on their civil liberties, that inevitable connection, as Barbara mentioned, between any given issue and democratic participation? With that said, panelists, this is the last question for you all. People often do not vote in their best interests or vote at all for various reasons, the aforementioned. How do we educate and get people to listen so they vote informed? And how do we combat the apathy that is so pervasive out there? Thinking about what Michael mentioned in regards to the lack of faith in our institutions. How do we get people engaged, and how do we combat the apathy? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start. Quickly, a couple things that I really thank you for that summary of all the questions. And thank you, audience. I love those points. They're amazingly wonderful, and it makes us feel good. First of all, everybody remember always, this democracy is ours. It doesn't belong to the politicians, doesn't belong to, quote, government. It belongs to us. And we have to be absolutely aggressive in enforcing what we see as the correct vision for this country. Actually, when you look at voter turnout for the last 2 midterm elections were the highest in history. So, the apathy thing, you got to kind of weigh it because it's the highest voter turnout we've ever had, 2018, 2022. And when I say the highest, other than back, over more than 100 years ago. So I think we got to understand what's driving that. Young people. Gen Z is really a powerful. Voters between 18 and 35 when they were questioned about in 2022, why did they vote? Remember, there was going to be the big old red wave. The red wave was just going to knock us all down, out. And it turned out to be a pink trickle. Why was it a pink trickle? Because of the amazing turnout of young people everywhere. Wisconsin, Michigan, everywhere where we saw, all of those states flip, in 2018, flip again in 2022. All of this was done by young voters. And what did they say when they were actually questioned about why did they turn out and vote? 37% of them, did you hear me? 37% said because they want to protect democracy. They understand. They are seeing what's happening. So invest in Gen Z. Invest in young voters. Yes, they're not voting at the capacity that they can, but they will, because right now they are the largest voting cohort in the country. And when they start using that, it's going to turn this whole country around. And that's why people like Cleta Mitchell and others are saying, you got to step down, come up with more voter suppression against young voters. Vote, young voters. We're committed to you. TJC is going to have a training institute where we're paying everybody's way. We're paying for stipends for 50 young people, ages 18 to 35, because we're investing in the next generation of voter advocates. We've been doing this. We're going to keep doing it until we get a huge cadre, thousands of trained, amazing voter advocates out there. So, go to tjcoalition.org again, and you'll find the application. And the application deadline is August 24th. Thank you.
Perfect. Colleagues, in our last few minutes.
I agree with Barbara, invest in Gen Z. I also was thinking, I haven't really experienced the apathy, but I think it's because I work a lot with young people who can't even vote yet. So I think a lot of it has to do with they're the ones going to school and not feeling safe because of the gun violence. They're the ones whose books are being attacked. So I've been seeing young people speaking out at school board meetings, educating themselves on what their rights are. We had young people testify in one of our hearings for a desegregation case, just very brave young folks who educate themselves on their rights and aren't afraid to speak up. And as Barbara said, eventually they will be able to vote. So I really think our efforts and our money are best invested there, because they really have been holding the banner when it comes to pushing our democracy to live up to its promises.
Yeah, I think that range of questions, Cedric, that you were posing really underlines the importance of CFER's series, this webinar series. There's so much to talk about. This could be like an overnight, but it's kind of not. So I want to just end by also talking about youth. This year, we, for the first time in our Year in Hate and Extremism report, labeled as an extremist group, Moms for Liberty. And
Yes.
the misinformation that is coming from these reactionary anti-student inclusion groups. It's very, very important to do something that Amber referenced, teach truth, and provide resources to be able to teach truth. And the last thing I want to say on gun violence, we recently did a survey. It's called the U.S. Youth Attitudes on Guns. We did it with American University's Parallel program, their Polarization and Extremism Lab. We did it with Everytown. It's a trailblazing attitudinal survey that we hope will lead to prevention. Prevention is the key. We can talk about hate crime enforcement, data collection, but the prevention of hate violence is the key and should be our focus. And giving young people the tools they need to be able to cut through the misinformation and disinformation is a fantastic resource for the organizations that we work for to be able to help lift up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Amber. Thank you to these fantastic panelists for your time and your expertise. The commemoration of the March on Washington and the continued work that we do, this series will continue next Wednesday at 1 p.m. with a panel discussion on evaluating our progress on jobs and freedom. You all may know that the March on Washington in 1963 was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, evaluating our progress on jobs and freedom and the needed next steps. You all should register for this event if you have not done so already. But with that said, this concludes today's panel discussion. Thank you for your questions, your comments, and your engagement. Have a great afternoon, everyone.